As the race for the White House heats up, tensions ripple across the country. In New York, authorities have arrested a man accused of threatening to burn down a polling station, while in Georgia, voting has resumed following a brief security pause. Against this backdrop, Trump projects unwavering confidence in a decisive victory, even as prosecutors emphasize the importance of a peaceful transition of power. With the stakes higher than ever, welcome to our special coverage of the U.S. elections.
Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? I don't think so.
You are rightly impatient for change. Just imagine Donald Trump with no guardrail.
This election is a choice between whether we will have 4 more years of incompetence or whether we'll begin the 4 greatest years in the history of our country.
Consequences of him ever being president again are brutally serious.
She's actually not as smart. And we will make America great again.
And when we fight, we win!
To help us analyze the latest developments in the U.S. elections, we're joined by Jim Townsend, a former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. Thank you for joining us here on Qnews. Firstly, do you think the recent arrest of a man in New York who threatened to burn down a polling station will impact the public perception of the election's integrity?
No, I think we're going to find during the course of the day a lot of this kind of incident happening in various parts of the country. It won't be a lot, but this unfortunately has become part of our electoral system. But the authorities are ready for this. The polling officials are ready for this kind of behavior. So I think we're going to be able to handle it. And I don't think it's going to change votes. And I don't think it's going to change the success of this election day.
Okay, so in light of the recent threat and the interruptions such as the temporary halt of voting in Georgia, what are national security agencies expected to play in safeguarding the election process during this tense time?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yes, in light of the various threats that that have been faced, including the temporary halt of voting in Georgia, how do you expect the voting process itself to work, and what does a national security agency expect to happen in order to safeguard the electoral process?
Well, my understanding in Georgia is that they've learned a lot from the last 4 years of elections there. The security people have as well. My expectations are in Georgia that the voting will go along smoothly. I think the voting turnout in Georgia is going to be very high, and it's going to be a very close contest there that many people will be watching to see how well Donald Trump does. He lost Georgia, as I remember, to Biden with a very thin margin. And so we'll have to see what happens there in Georgia. But I think in terms of the mechanics of the voting across the country, we're in a better place today than we were 4 years ago, and certainly better than we were 8 years ago. And that includes also dealing with misinformation and manipulation coming from Russia and Iran and other places where these countries have tried to use social media to influence American voters. That has been a major problem that the administration has had to deal with, and the companies that run the internet have had to deal with. And I'm hoping that the American voter is smarter than they would have been 4 years ago or even 8 years ago when we began to see this kind of manipulation happen.
So I know that you're saying things are better than they were maybe 8 years ago, but the U.S. prosecutors have emphasized the need for a peaceful transfer of power in this polarized climate? Because you also stated before that you're going to see incidents like the ones we've seen in other places, like security threats and the voting process having been closed in Georgia as well. How can the electoral process be upheld and the principle or the rule of law be upheld?
Well, that's a really good question and an important one. Again, I think we have learned quite a bit over the past 4 years from the experience with President Trump and the transfer of power during that time. There were a lot of law cases, a lot of legal cases that were brought by the Republicans charging irregularities in the voting, and those were disproven. The courts heard the cases and said they were false cases. The laws and the procedures have changed also, so that the counting of the electoral votes is now going to be tightened up, if you will. There's also a lot of changes that have been made in terms of how the voting is undertaken and how it's counted, et cetera, et cetera. Law enforcement also has learned a lot since over the past 4 years in terms of how do you deal with problems such as you raised that happened in Georgia? How do you deal with that at a polling place? How can you deter that from happening? How do you have security people there that are protecting the poll workers and they're not there to intimidate the voter? They are there to help the poll workers to keep bad actors away. So the electoral process is now safer, and it is now, I guess, more resilient than it has been in the past. And certainly there are a lot of eyes watching this now, whether it's law enforcement or the poll workers themselves, the political parties, to make sure that nothing untoward happens.
Yes. Well, since you talked about enforcing the law and all of that, given former President Trump's strong confidence in his chances of winning and not saying that if he loses that he'll concede, how do you view the U.S. military's potential role in ensuring a peaceful transition of power if the results are contested?
The U.S. military role is going to be non-existent. The U.S. military, as you know, they are there to defend the Constitution.
The National Guard won't be in there anywhere?
What's that?
The National Guard won't have any sort of hand in trying to ensure a smooth transition of power?
No, the transition of power will happen politically. Yes. It'll happen on Capitol Hill physically is where that happens. The National Guard or the active duty U.S. military, they are not involved unless there is a January 6th type of situation like we saw, 4 years ago. The National Guard was called in for that. And then during the inauguration on January 20th, the National Guard came out to make sure that the people who caused that trouble earlier were not going to come back and disrupt the inauguration. So they are there to protect and secure things like the inauguration and to make sure there's not some type of unrest. But in terms of the transfer of power, how that is passed from one party to the other or one individual to the other, that is strictly done on a political basis. There is no involvement of law enforcement or the National Guard or the military at all, unless there is unrest. And the governor, in the case of the National Guard, the governor of the state calls out the National Guard for protection, but it won't be involved in the actual transfer of power.
Okay, now Trump also came out with a statement saying that his victory will be decisive, suggesting the results will not be close. How realistic is this claim, especially in light of the recent developments in battleground states where everything seems to be, quite close and quite tight?
Well, I know that former President Trump has said a lot of things about, how close it's going to be and whether there's cheating and whether there is and whether there will be, problems when it comes to such a tight race and counting all the ballots, overseas ballots. ballots voted by military forces, etc. He says a lot of things, but he has no power in this. There are elected officials in every state and in every community whose job it is to make sure things go smoothly according to the laws of that state and the federal laws as well. And so no matter what Trump might say or might fear one way or another, this vote, which is, as you said, which is very close, very tight, this vote is going to be done under many watchful eyes. It's going to be done in a way that it'll be hard for anyone to cheat. And we don't have a big example in the United States so far in our history. We haven't had a lot of trouble with massive fraud in the voting. So we have a pretty good track record on that, but you can't ever take it for granted. You always have to have people watching. And in this case, certainly everyone is going to be watching very closely, so that if Donald Trump tomorrow, after the results come in, if he feels that he is behind, or if he feels there has been some type of fraud in the voting, he's going to have proof. He's going to have to really be able to demonstrate this. And there are so many eyes watching the process. I don't think he's going to be able to prove anything in terms of something going wrong. But he will try. He will try if he wants to make the American people feel that something is amiss. You know, that was part of his playbook 4 years ago, where he wanted to cast doubt among the Americans. And
which kind of
yes.
brings in the next question. I mean, as you've said, that it's very close and no one can really call what's happening, and the American public is generally polarized. With rising concerns over the potential unrest, how prepared is the U.S. to address election-related violence? You said that things have improved in the last 8 years, but do they have like a plan for things if things get violent, such as the recent incidents that took place in New York while trying to maintain a democratic process?
Yes, there's definitely a plan. I would say that every state has a plan. I think every community where all this voting would be taking place, they have local plans as well. Local police who are going to be available if there's an outbreak of violence. And the training of the poll workers themselves has been very intense. I think every poll worker has been trained to make sure that there are no mishaps. I just voted an hour ago. I voted and I saw that things ran very smoothly according to an obvious plan that they had. And it was a very good, smooth experience. So I think at the state level, at the local level, there are plans and there's training. At the national level, certainly that is happening as well, in terms of making sure that on a national basis that the states have what they need and the localities have what they need in terms of people or questions that are answered. Many, many, many lawyers I know are standing by to help. So I think I have not seen this country so prepared for this day as it is today, whether it is the polling, voting process itself, or its security to make sure that if someone's going to cause trouble, that's handled very quickly.
Yes. So again, you spoke earlier about the idea of a peaceful transfer of power, and that it's basically political, and that whether it be the military or law enforcement, they don't interfere in how the process itself takes place, but they ensure that there is security. Given recent statements by Trump, for instance, do you think that it's a high stakes event, I suppose, and the national security responsibility is much greater to ensure a democratic cycle going on properly?
That's right. That's exactly right. I think people have been alarmed over the past 4 to 8 years that our process might need to be changed in some ways to make sure that the democratic process is up to date. The democratic process takes advantage of the high tech world, if you will, to have voting booths that you can't interfere with, that type of thing. It is very important on the national security level that other nations see that we are doing our best to make sure our democracy is run efficiently and truthfully. That's showing, certainly the Russians or the Chinese or others were trying to show how democracy can work. So on national security, it's very important. Local security is important so that the voter feels safe and the voter has confidence in the electoral process, has
Yes.
confidence that their vote counts. That's really important.
Yes. Since you brought up the idea of, voter confidence, considering the security breaches that took place in Georgia, as well as the ongoing legal battles over voting rights and whatnot, do you believe this is the overall, could this have an overall impact or disrupt the voter turnout or the confidence in the democratic process itself? Could people actually start to question the process?
Well, I think what we're starting to see, I think what we'll have to wait till tonight, but I think we will see that turnout has been very good. I know I've heard that my local voting area, that there were long lines of people waiting to go in and vote, and they felt excited and confident about it. I think the claims that Trump has made in the past, or various things that might have happened today that you've talked about, I don't think that is going to have an impact on making voters stay away or lack confidence. I think in a lot of ways that makes the voter feel that his or her vote is even more important. That this is something that we have to show our neighbors and our country and the world that despite violence every now and then breaking out or whatever it might be, that we have confidence in our voting. And that we will go and do our bit. We will go be responsible citizens and vote how we want to vote. So I believe we will find tonight or tomorrow morning when votes are counted and we have a good idea about the turnout. I think you'll see that there's going to be a record turnout. That's my guess.
Okay, thank you, Jim Townsend, for sharing your insights on the current U.S. elections, and thank you for joining us here on Q News. Thank you so much.
Taking the time to vote, it really does make a difference. So thank you for that. And you enjoy your day, okay?
Madam President!
All right, this is a real phone bank. Get back to making calls. Please, please, please. We got voters to still get out.
Jennifer, it's Kamala Harris. How are you? I am well. I just wanted to call you, check in, and make sure you know where you can go vote today if you haven't already. Have you voted yet? Oh, thank you. Thank you so very much. And thank you for just being active and participating in this very, very important process. This is the foundation of our democracy, but we can't do it without people like you. Just knowing our work. Oh, good. What's your name?
Thank you so much for joining us.
Sage? Hi, it's Kamala Harris. I can't wait for you to grow 10 years more. But, oh, you know what? IEPs are so important. We have so much work to do to just keep reinforcing the Department of Education and getting all the resources there. And Sage, I can tell you're really smart and you're working really hard, and I'm counting on you, okay? Because you are still a leader at every age that you are. At 8 years old, that's a serious leadership. So you're in 3rd grade? Yeah.
That's a live feed of Vice President Kamala Harris at one of her campaign centers in D.C., joking with the staff there and discussing the latest when it comes to the campaign and voter turnout in Washington, D.C. and across the United States as well. As you can see, the mood there is quite light and cheery. And you can see there's a scrum of photographers as well there alongside the Vice President, who is there to ensure the electoral process is going just fine, and that she's also addressing people of the campaign and her party, in addition to taking some joyful phone calls, it seems, with people who want to talk to her over the phone from the campaigners. That was part of Kamala Harris's visit to one of the headquarters of her campaign, where she's following up on the latest when it comes to the U.S. elections in Washington, D.C. And now we move on to the voting landscape in the U.S. that is shaped by key trends from increasing turnout to shifting demographics. As we witness the 2024 elections, the influence of groups like young voters, women and African Americans will play a pivotal role in deciding the outcome. And now we're joined by Mr. Brent Sadler, a former Pentagon official, to discuss the impact of the 2024 U.S. presidential elections on defense policy as well as military strategy. Thank you, sir, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Firstly, let's start off by asking, how could the election results impact the direction of U.S. defense and military strategy, especially regarding the ongoing tensions with Russia and China?
Well, yes. It's a key question. Unfortunately, it doesn't get enough, I guess, emphasis here in domestic American politics, as more what we would call kitchen table issues like taxes and inflation tend to take the lead. I think it's probably best to break it down as the stark choice between a Trump administration versus a Harris administration vis-a-vis relations with Russia, then another category with Iran, and then, of course, the most important with China. And I think on the issue with China, you're going to see the less of a real meaningful difference. There's been a consensus in D.C. now for well over the last 7 or 8 years that views China as an adversary, and that economic as well as diplomatic and military improvement of our position needs to be invested in. So I don't think on China much will change in a meaningful way. I think when it comes to Iran in the Middle East, I think you could not find a more stark difference between a Trump, which would be very clear-eyed, and a more speak softly and carry a big stick kind of mentality, versus a Kamala Harris, which has tried through diplomacy and through inducements to bring the mullahs in Tehran into a favorable or a détente type of relationship with the United States. And that has not worked for the last few years.
Yeah, well, what about Russia? Because I know that the perspective of both candidates is quite different when it comes to dealing with Russia. How do you see this being handled if either one wins?
Well, the first thing is I think most of the media here in the United States is mischaracterizing, again, playing to a domestic political audience, what a return of President Trump would be. And looking at his track record with Russia, I think Russia would be in store for a much more forceful position, despite the rhetoric from a President Trump. Whether or not it means open-ended provision of munitions and weapons to Ukraine, set that aside, I could see early on in the Trump administration a much more forceful, allowing Ukraine full use of the weapons that it's been given to bring the war to a rapid conclusion, but more likely to get to a circumstance both sides would be compelled to a negotiated solution that actually meets American national interest. The Kamala Biden administration, unfortunately, has really not laid out a strategy, and so we're in more of a tension otherwise.
Okay, well, since you talked about the idea that foreign policy in general is not something that is focused on necessarily when it comes to the American public, but in light of the heightened security concerns surrounding foreign influence when it comes to the 2024 elections, how can the Pentagon and other U.S. agencies ensure that national security remains uncompromised when it comes to the elections, and no one can claim, that there was some sort of, something happening when it comes to the electoral process where, one party or the other says that it was unfair?
No, absolutely. Again, the American public is very skeptical given the last, 8 years of recent history, but certainly since the COVID epidemic and the suppression of information under the guise of it being claimed as misinformation. Some of it, of course, foreign influence, even in this current election, which we know Iranian sources as well as Russian sources, and one not mentioned enough, Chinese influence as well, has all been at play. It has to be very transparent what the government does in exposing and going after foreign influences, not dependent on what side of the political spectrum that it favors. And unfortunately, the track record's not very clear on that. But we'll see in the day after tomorrow when we wake up and we start hearing the lawyers getting engaged as to which elections or which districts had suspect activities, and how the government and the agencies respond in a nonpartisan way. That is actually going to be the proof that the election system is being adhered to in a nonpartisan and in a principled manner.
So in your view, what role should the intelligence services and the Pentagon play when it comes to protecting the integrity of the US elections, and how can the military actually be effectively used to address the growing threats rather to foreign influence in the US electoral process? Is it the military, or is it, cybersecurity, for instance?
Well, first, let me take the most dangerous in American history, going back to our Revolutionary War and then reiterated again during our Civil War in the mid-1800s. The military is prohibited from playing a role in the domestic politics, and it would be very dangerous for even military intelligence agencies to play an active role in going out after information or misinformation associated with the campaigns. Better and the more appropriate agency would be the FBI, working hand in hand with the CIA to track down and to blunt any foreign influences that are at play right now in the United States.
Okay, so will the focus be on cybersecurity, or is there other actionable plans on the ground, for instance, when it comes to protecting the integrity of the process?
Well, it's comprehensive. I mean, the cyber is only one part of this. Things like social media, bots are at the low end of it, to actual influence information campaigns to try to sway particular decision makers, perhaps say the lead chief of police for Capitol Police and security around Capitol Hill. So it goes from a more general, low-level kind of information to a very targeted. And that's where the FBI, CISA, which is another agency to go after the cyber aspects of this, are designed and should be actively engaged. We know they have been because of testimony before the Hill, specifically about Iranian hands behind many of the campus protests in support of Hamas in the recent few months.
Yeah, but that doesn't necessarily, address the U.S. elections itself. But I mean, since you've brought up the idea of disinformation, the U.S. intelligence community is warned about, foreign disinformation campaigns, especially, as you've said, from Iran, in addition to Russia, aimed at undermining the trust in the election process. What role could the U.S. intelligence services play when it comes to this, and how can you help make the American public aware of this sort of disinformation so that they are not, sucked into the idea of this disinformation?
Well, first and foremost is not to try to restrict Americans' access to information, good, bad, or indifferent. The agencies should be on the lookout for nefarious illegal activities, no matter where it comes from. But the worst thing that could happen is for the federal government to start to dictate or determine what information is good and what information is bad. That is censorship, and it actually undermines one of the core principles of American freedom and democracy. It's one of our civil rights that would be undermined. So we have to be very careful against that.
Well, I mean, yes, it's understandable what you're saying, but in a world where information is so easily available, there's so much of it, it's very hard to distinguish between what's real and what's not. What would you, tell the average American to do when it comes to digesting this sort of information?
So from my experience living both in and outside of the United States and having some familiarity with multiple languages, is that the truth is usually in between your mainstream sources in Democrat and Republican storylines. And so get your news and force yourself to get your news from multiple sites, even news sources that you don't really find very appealing, but try to challenge your own assumptions, have critical questioning attitude, and find and search for the truth. Don't search for news that just reevaluates or reassesses what you already know or what you're predisposed to believe in. It's a tall bill for most Americans and most people who are busy, but that's really the best advice that I've been giving for pretty much 20 years, the advent of social media and the popularity of a lot of this information-based, remote-based news sources.
Okay, Brent Sadler, a former Pentagon official, thank you so much for joining us here on our special coverage of the U.S. elections, and thank you for your insights. This brings us to the end of our special coverage of the election day in the United States for this hour, but stay tuned for more updates here on Q News.